From the New Arts and Media Studios in Milwaukee, I'm Charles Purcell. This is The Log. Well, it's a Monday, so we tell each other about our weekend. How was your weekend? Or maybe I shouldn't think that way. That's old thinking. That's capitalist thinking. On the other hand, I suppose you could say just the opposite. It's labor movement thinking. The labor movement created the weekend. All right, let's keep that positive spin. Well, speaking of the labor movement, I saw Reds again, the great movie Reds. 1981, won a ton of Academy Awards. Warren Beatty produced, directed, and starred with Diane Keaton. Really, really great film. I saw it when it first came out. I think I've seen it once since then, and I thought it was time to look at it again. I was reminded by Jacobin, which I've mentioned several times on this podcast. You really need to, whatever social media you're hooked up with, you need to like or subscribe or however it works to Jacobin.com. They're so great. Essays every single day. And they're pretty active at posting from their past issues as well. Jacobin magazine. Great socialist magazine. And they had an article about Reds and how great the message was. It's still, to this day, it stands alone. There's no other major American Hollywood motion picture that portrays the Russian Revolution with such affection. Now, it's a mixed bag, of course. It certainly isn't propaganda by any stretch. It's a very honest look at how the workers of the world, if I could coin a phrase, including those right here in America, were thrilled with what happened in those 10 days that shook the world, which the film is based on, at least in part. It's about the Warren Beatty character is the writer, the journalist, and revolutionary who wrote that very seminal book, 10 Days That Shook the World, about the revolution. So it's a fantastic look at the moment in history. I'm always looking for, if you have any recommendations, let me know. I'm always looking for good political movies, especially anti-capitalist movies. We just spent a lot of time, I won't go back into it, I promise. We spent a couple of episodes talking about how the corporate media will never go so far as to give you information or entertainment that will bring them down. The capitalists aren't going to sell you movies or TV shows or magazines or newspapers to help you bring them down. It's not going to happen. And, as great as Reds was, and I highly recommend it if you haven't seen it or if you haven't seen it for a long time, as great as it was, I don't think it's going to cause its viewers to go fill the streets and create a socialist revolution. No, as I said, it's a mixed bag. It's a very truthful, very honest, brutally honest at times, especially politically. Because one of the messages I take away from the film, and, it's something I've been thinking a lot about lately anyway. So, when you're already in a certain mindset, you find, it's confirmation bias, basically. You find things that support your idea. Well, I experienced that watching Reds again. As much as I loved it, and I really was inspired by the enthusiasm and the success of what happened in the Soviet Union. Very quickly, almost immediately, the Communist Party in Russia, and I don't have to be your historian. You probably know more about this than I do. So just to point out what the movie is honest about and what I'm honest about is as great as the revolution was, and I would have been right there with them. I would have been cheering them on. The Communist Party immediately started jailing people and executing people and taking over media and trampling on individual rights. And of course, it was a horror show. So So without going down that whole road, and I don't want you to ever imagine for a second that I'm a fan of the Soviet Union. No, I am a fan of revolution. There are lots of different ways that can go. There's a great scene between Jack Reed, the character that Warren Beatty plays, and Emma Goldman, the wonderful social anarchist. He's defending the Soviets. So, yeah, we got to crack some heads. And Emma Goldman, who's been a philosophical, intellectual, revolutionary hero of mine since I was a kid, makes a very forceful argument. It's a beautiful scene in the movie. Makes a very forceful argument about freedom of speech and freedom of thought. And if they're going to squash that, then what's the point? That is the revolution. Freedom. We don't want to just exchange the shackles of capitalism for the shackles of an authoritarian communist regime. Of course not. And it's a great scene in the film. It's a great political debate. This Jack Reed character, all this is based obviously on actual facts and real characters. Jack Reed, as portrayed in the film, goes through a metamorphosis more than once, three times, as he's discovering where he is as first a journalist and then a full-blown revolutionary, literally working in the propaganda office of the Soviet government. So, one of the main points I take away, and something I've been thinking a lot about recently, is the futility of parties. You and I had a long conversation about the idea of a no-party system. Many will advocate for the two-party system. It's allegedly what we have now. And we do. I've never been one to put the Republicans and the Democrats in the exact same boat. I understand that argument. They're both corporate parties. Of course, I get that. They're very different, at least as they stand today. And since I've been making this argument for many years, in the last couple of years, the difference has gotten even more stark as the Republicans have gone completely out of their minds. No, I don't put the Democrats and the Republicans in the same boat. They're in the same capitalist boat. Yes, they are. So I'll give you that. But more generally speaking, the idea philosophically of a two-party system where ideas can be debated, I understand the appeal of that. For the most part, I agree with it, except for the party part. I don't see the necessity. And as much as I want the end of capitalism, I don't know if a party, a third party, a new party, or the Democratic Socialists or the Social Democrats or the Socialist USA that's the problem. The problem is exactly what the film pointed out so clearly. It gets bogged down in all this infighting. I don't know how many socialist parties we have right now in America. You'd have to tell me. I don't follow this closely. I honestly don't know. I think there's 3 or 4. There's at least a couple. I know that for sure. And they hate each other. And they're in social media trolling each other all the time. Oh, you're not a real socialist. Oh, you're not. You don't understand. I don't think the party system will work. I think it has failed. I think we've watched it fail. I really believe that our next evolution ought to be, I don't know if it will be, but I think it ought to be not a 2-party system or a 3-party system or a multi-party system as they have sort of in the parliamentary systems of Europe, which can just be an awful mess. I mean, shoot, that's how we got Hitler, right? All this parliamentary wrangling and having to form coalitions. Israel went through it. I think they had 3 or 4 elections where they just couldn't come up with an answer. That's exactly how Hitler came to power. The parliamentary system just wasn't working, and they just couldn't come up with a leader. And so that opens the door for these sort of backdoor maneuverings. Now, of course, we have the American version that the deplorables are attempting to create. And to a large extent, I mean, they're having a lot of success. The Orange Menace and his party, and it is entirely his party now. That's just all there is to it. That debate is over. The couple of exceptions are just that. And as soon as the 22 midterms are over, they'll be gone. So the Orange Menace Party has successfully changed voting laws in, is it 19? I forget the exact number. I think it's at least 19 states have changed their voting laws. The coup of January 6th never ended. It started months, if not years before. It continues to this day. It has a violent wing, that violent faction, kind of like the SS. It has its faction in seats of power at every level, and they're very good at gaining seats in local school boards, city councils, state legislatures. So they are working tirelessly every day with great success. The current Republican Party, the Orange Menace Party. Now, we have a two-party system. What are the Democrats doing? Well, they're failing. If you just looked at their positions, at their programs, at their proposed legislation, or even some legislation they've actually managed to pass, you say, well, not bad. It's your basic sort of centrist Scandinavian model, at least what their goals are. They're not revolutionaries. They're good people, and they want good things. And if they were able to pass their agenda, it would improve the nation. Let's go back to the Reds film for a moment. Jack Reed, the protagonist, at the beginning of the film, he's backing Wilson as a journalist/activist because Wilson is promising an anti-war agenda. This is prior to the U.S. entry into the World War I. And Jack Reed is making arguments that would be very familiar today. That, okay, well, we're leftists, we're radicals, we're revolutionaries, but, we're left with no choice. We had to back Joe Biden in 2020. Certainly not during the primaries. But once that was over, and it was head-to-head Joe Biden against the Orange Menace, yeah. I can't imagine a world where the Orange Menace had won re-election in 2020. How just indescribably horrible it would be. I mean, it's bad enough. Our troubles are bad enough. They'd be exponentially worse. So it's a strong argument. You have to have organization. You have to have a party. But I don't know. I still can't quite get there. I understand that sometimes we're in an emergency situation. But then it's just, 4 years later, it's another emergency situation. Every election is described as an emergency situation. That's how they keep us, as my father-in-law used to say, that's how they get you. Or as Emma Goldman, my hero, the great social anarchist and character in the film Reds, says in that film, elections are the opium of the masses here in America. They put us to sleep every 4 years. They make us think that maybe this can be okay. But how much more proof do we need after years and years and decades of this fledgling democracy? I mean, have we ever been a democracy? Best case scenario, maybe 1965 to 1980-ish, somewhere in the 80s when democracy died. Or at least it's been on its deathbed since then. I think it was put in its coffin when Congress failed to convict the Orange Menace not once but twice when he was rightfully impeached. You can point to lots of moments in political history of the last 4 decades. And you can look at lots of inflection points, as the current president is calling our moment right now an inflection point for democracy. But how long were we really a democracy? 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. Before then, how do you call us a democracy? You certainly can't call us a democracy prior to women's suffrage. And I don't know how you call us a democracy prior to the Voting Rights Act. So maybe we had a moment. Maybe the promise of the American idea could be realized at some point. And maybe we had some ideas in the 60s and 70s that there could be cultural and political and, dare I say, even spiritual growth in this country. There seemed to be some hope. only to have Ronald Reagan hypnotize a majority of American voters, just completely hoodwink most of America into believing its own lies. Lies about trickle-down economics, lies about our role in the global economy and our role in the global geopolitical world, the U.S. military, convincing us that it was a force for good. Because we had that one moment when we put Hitler down, followed by a post-war boom, followed by a cultural awakening. So, yeah, from the mid-60s to about 1980, it seems like we had a sliver of hope of actually becoming a democracy, actually becoming something that we could stand up and be proud of. We never got there because we were just taking our first baby steps when Ronald Reagan and the Republican Party killed America in its cradle. A resurgence of racism, a resurgence of Gilded Age economics. And we've just been spiraling ever since, culminating in the Orange Menace and the insurrection he incited and led. And now bolstered by an entire major American political party doing everything in their power to become an authoritarian minority rule party. By changing election laws, by taking advantage of broken systems, namely the Electoral College and the makeup of the U.S. Senate. And I'll be damned, they're awful close to getting this done. The next few months here, between now and November, are really going to tell the tale. So, as you and I discussed at length, I'm thinking, I don't know, is there a way to, and this sticks in my throat because it sounds so ridiculous, is there a way to transform the Democratic Party into a party that could actually compete with the Republicans? I mean, we've watched them now. We've watched them for a very long time. And they're capable of just about anything because they're willing to do just about anything. There are 3 seats on the Supreme Court of the United States that were literally stolen. We're going to have 1 million people dead of COVID because the Republican Party is perfectly willing, almost happy, to let people die in the service of their own wacky version of what they call freedom. So I'm having very little faith in any kind of a party system, even a left-wing socialist party that I could really get behind, because one of 2 things would have to happen to defeat the Republican Party in a party system. 1, the Democrats would have to be transformed into a party that has the power and wherewithal and guts and savvy and strategy and enthusiasm and willingness and cohesion to actually go toe-to-toe with the Republicans. Transform themselves into that? I don't know how we can believe that anymore. Or, number 2, a third party. It's happened before in American history. Parties have died. The Whigs died. Republicans were born. Back when they were the good guys, if you know your history. Republicans used to be the good guys. So, yeah, we've seen it happen. I don't know if I'm willing to pin my hopes on that. On some third party gaining enough strength to compete. And as I mentioned earlier, if it's going to be a socialist party, then we've got to solve the infighting. One of the multiple socialist parties would have to reign supreme, and the others would have to join in or fall away. Now, what are the chances of this? So it was just kind of a reminder as I watched the film Reds that I am really losing faith in the very concept of a party system. And just to retrace the steps of what you and I have talked about earlier, the idea of a zero-party system, maybe the time has come. And if enough leaders could step forward, leaders in their community, in their neighborhoods, and do their thing on the streets, what activists do, and some of them run for office, run for school board, city council, mayor, state legislature, on up to Congress, and eventually the White House. as a real, true independent, making only one real promise, pledging an allegiance to democracy. That's the only litmus test. There's an awful lot to debate on the political spectrum, but that's the one thing that maybe we can all agree on. That we all think democracy is the right way to go. And if enough independents could take these leadership roles, and if enough of us could support them, and we all promise to each other that no party will ever get our vote again. If you are affiliated with an organized party, with committees and caucuses and meetings and platforms and alliances and the whole game, that disqualifies you. Yeah, the portrayal in the film reads about the infighting of the American socialist parties, and then the infighting within the victorious party in Moscow, and then their very quick, almost immediate transformation into an authoritarian party, even after a truly, and I don't use this word very often, glorious revolution, which it was. I would have been right there with them. But once the party leaders occupied those palatial halls of power, the workers' revolution for power, for dignity, was quickly left behind in favor of an autocratic regime. And I'm thinking maybe, well, the problem is inherent in the very idea of a party. At worst, you become authoritarian, you become a dictatorship, something the Republican Party is well on their way to achieving right now as we speak. And if you're not willing to go to those extremes, as the Democrats are not willing to go, I'll give them credit for that, well, then they just become ineffectual. They're trying to play by rules that no longer apply. And just look at the spectrum right now in America. Where less than a third of Americans even describe themselves as Republicans, register as Republicans. And another third identify as Democrats. I think if we could make the case that it's the parties themselves, the very fact of them, that there is an inherent fatal design flaw in the party system, I think that's an argument that could really get a lot of agreement. I think if that argument can be made, and if Americans were convinced that there was an actual option, they didn't have to vote for one or the other every 2 years and every 4 years. They didn't have to succumb to what Emma Goldman called the opium of the American masses, that is, elections. They could actually vote for a true independent who made that vow. A true independent doesn't have to have a platform, as I said, they can lay out their ideas, they can promise to lead, they can promise to listen, they can promise to work hard, they can show their experience, their ability. Show me what you got, show me your resume. But I'm only going to ask you to promise one thing. Well, two things. Number one, you will never join or form a party because the very idea itself is ruinous. And number two, you are 100% devoted to democracy. You tell me those two things, I'm going to listen to you. And if we have people who meet those two requirements, promise to never join or form a party, promise to always fight for democracy, you get candidates on every level of government, local, state, fed. You get activists in the streets. You get writers, you get artists. We don't have to agree on anything else. The most beautiful thing we have going for us is our individual freedom of thought and expression, and the ability to speak freely and to debate the issues. These are so red, white, and blue American. I don't know how we lose with this message. A zero-party system. I mentioned people at all levels, office holders, activists, artists, writers. Everybody has their role, and no one should be apologetic about it. Whatever you do, if you're an activist, if you're out yelling on the streets, and if you're marching and chanting and singing songs and carrying banners, good for you. That is absolutely necessary. If you instead are a wonky, nerdy office holder, you want to get in where the laws are written, where the laws are debated, where policies are made. You want to get on that school board and you want to have those fights. My God, the respect I have for you. You're absolutely necessary. And I definitely would never discount the role, they're absolutely vital, the role of artists, of writers, musicians, storytellers, podcasters. People are awfully quick to dismiss the role of the people doing the hollering. Constantly being badgered and harassed and mocked for using social media. Oh, Facebook, Twitter, whatever, name it, Instagram. No, you can't dismiss that. Social media is way too powerful to be left to people taking selfies and taking pictures of their dinner and making up little dances. And all of that's fine. All that's fine. Go ahead, do it. All I'm saying is anyone who's creating content with a mission, with a soul, and again, with my two provisions, I'm only asking for two things. Never join or form a party, and always be devoted to democracy. If you and I can agree on those two things, you and I are comrades. All right. Let's go get them. I love you. I'm Charles Purcell.